Welcome to the ISO 14001-2026 Executive Overview. Hi, my name is Jim Lee. I'm the CEO of simpleQuE, and with me is Jared Gravatt.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, my name is Jared Gravatt. I am a principal consultant and auditor, extensive background in quality, environmental health, and safety with third-party experience. Currently have a master's degree in environmental management and been doing this line of work for going on 13, 14 years.
Thanks, Jared. It's been 11 years since the ISO 14001 standard has been revised. The rules for ISO standards is that they need to be reviewed every 5 years to determine whether or not they need to be upgraded, revised. And because of COVID, in the middle of that timing, it was pushed out. So there was a delay, and then it was decided to try to accelerate. Originally, it was decided they'd wait another 5 years, but that's too long to wait. So they started working on that transition a few years ago to get this revision out. The objectives of this video are to go through what's changed in the 14001-2026 revision. We want to make sure you understand what was changed and why it was changed, and recognize the impacts that can affect your company. We want to make sure you avoid the pitfalls for over-interpreting requirements and making sure that you are aware of what really is changing in the standard versus semantics or trivial things that might be interpreted as a requirement for the new standard. We also want to help you understand what needs to be done next for your organization as you prepare to upgrade to the new standard. The changes for 14001-2026 are really minor. The changes are focusing on clarifying existing requirements, introducing very limited new requirements, and a significant amount of changes are trying to align to Annex SL, which is a harmonized structure for all management system standards, whether it's environmental, quality, safety, information security, all trying to align to be more harmonized. And that has driven a lot of changes to this standard. Bottom line is this is an evolution. It's not a major systems change.
Jim, audience, this starts with the high level structure. And, of course, a couple of years ago, they came out with a climate change addendum to not only the ISO 14001 standard, but ISO 9001, ISO 45001 for health and safety. But because climate change is, could mean a lot of different things, they're just trying to clarify some of the, key drivers behind it. Of course, the climate change, environmental conditions shaping content, biodiversity, availability of natural resources. Of course, we're looking at the supply chain and the life cycle risks, statutory and stakeholder expectations, those sorts of things. So it's to kind of help focus a little bit more on what would truly be applicable to an organization, because there is quite a bit that relates to the working environment, things that the organization can affect or things that can affect the organization. So we're just trying to add some clarity on what some of the expectations are. Not to be meant to be an all-inclusive list, as some may or may not apply to the organization.
So we see from the timeline, the initial release of the standard back in 1996, and it's gone through several revisions. And it's been 11 years since the last revision, thanks to COVID delays. With the standard being released in April of 2026, companies will have 3 years to upgrade. So by April of 2029, everyone will have been required to upgrade to the new standard.
I work for a certification body as well as, with simpleQuE. So, I get the luxury of, actually making recommendation for certification. And historically, when they have made changes to a standard and it hasn't been of significance, typically a certification body will work with the client and say, if you are at a surveillance audit and want to make a transition, we'll treat it as such and just verify the additional requirements are, and then update the certificate based on that. And in doing so, we'll keep the same expiration date of your current certificate. Years past, with other standards, they've elected to do recertification at that transition time. And then, of course, the problem is it causes a bottleneck every 3 years where everybody's due for the same type of assessment. So there's no plan to call out a recert, and I don't believe there would be any extra time required for that particular audit. And it's really up to the organization to determine when they're ready. But as Jim alluded to, 2029 is the deadline, because that's when they will basically obsolete the current ISO 14001 standard.
Bottom line is you'll work with your certification body in determining what's the right timing, whether it's in 2027, 2028, and what's the right timing with regard to your recertification, or definitely during a surveillance or a recertification. You wouldn't pull in a separate audit just to upgrade. So Annex SL is the harmonized structure that ISO has established for all of their management system standards. It's trying to make it easier to be certified to multiple standards using the same structure, same 10 clauses. 4 through 10 are the requirements that you have to be audited against and comply with. And it includes, every management system standard has internal audits and management reviews and document control and all of those kinds of things. So some of the changes that are occurring with the 14001 release are, first, terminology changes. The word fulfill is not being used. They want companies to meet compliance obligations, not fulfill compliance obligations. Just semantics. Might be better translatability for other languages, but it's just to provide some clarity. Another change is where in the past it said this international standard in referring to ISO 14001 in the document. It just now is going to say this document. No new requirements, just different semantics. With documented information, it used to be maintain documented information. Now they're saying available as documented information. And then with retaining documented information for records, they now say documented information shall be available as evidence. So just semantics. Outsourced processes are now externally provided processes, products, and services. That's more in line with all of the management system standards where you're outsourcing activities to an external provider. Another change for Annex SL is management reviews are broken into 3 sections for all of the standards. ISO is already there. 14001 wasn't. It was just 1 clause. Now they've broken it into 3. And although there's just a minor new requirement we'll go through, but the breaking it into 3 clauses, all of the content is still there. There's no new content of the requirements per se, just broken down into 3 sections. And then continual improvement has 3 clauses historically, and 10.3 has just moved into 10.1. Verbiage is very similar, same intent, same requirement. And then what we'll find in Annex A are a lot of guidance explanations of each of the sections of the standard that is new to help companies understand more about the background and the reasons for compliance and the requirements, meeting the requirements, and understanding the requirements in a way that is different from the actual standard of you shall do this. The Annex A is providing some guidance on here are some ways that companies can demonstrate compliance.
This annex of the standard, more specifically Annex A3, is a key section to read because of key terminology, such as the word consider. It's necessary to think about the topic, but it can be excluded where it is taken into account. It's necessary to think about the topic, but it can't be excluded. So, it's important to look at those definitions because they are used throughout the standard, and depending, if the word consider or take into account is listed will determine, your course of action. So it's important to read those. There's a couple other terminologies that are listed in there that they actually harmonize across all the standards as well. I know that for the longest time, ISO 9000 didn't have that clarification of concept section. But so not only for this standard, but for the other standards that organizations may choose to implement, that terminology is common across all standards. So it's important to look at those. And as you read into the main clauses 4 through 10, you'll see those words used throughout. And they do have distinct differences, so it's important to pay attention to that. But it was used in the old standards too. Like Jim said, it's somewhat semantics, but they do have important meanings. So we encourage people to review that as well. The context, the organization, it's essentially a combination of section 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3, and this kind of helps set the stage for the balance of the management system. With the context, you really have to know, what the external and internal issues are that face the organization. Of course, that are capable of having an impact on the management system. Of course, I spoke earlier about a couple years ago, they added the climate change to the standards. So organizations have to determine if climate change is a relevant issue. Now, of course, with that, it goes beyond that to look at, resource availability, biodiversity, ecosystem health, look at pollution levels. It's just, like I said, just to kind of help, find what the current state of affairs are for the organization. And then with that, they'll be able to determine, what course of actions they're going to take. And with that, of course, they have stakeholders, they have the needs and expectations, or what they call requirements. And the new standard is basically stating that the organization has to determine if interested parties have climate change type requirements. In doing audits for a number of years, especially with companies that deal with organizations based out of Europe, they're starting to already look at that. So that's important to, ask the question of your interested parties, especially customers, are they, wanting us to do climate change initiatives, greenhouse gas, carbon disclosure. So there's a lot of things that, from a stakeholder standpoint. And of course, with that, you're going to consider those when developing the scope of the management system, which is, of course, going to be part of your activities, products, and services. And the one thing that they want you to, especially with the scope, you got to consider life cycle perspective, when developing the scope. And as I mentioned, it's something to think about, but it doesn't necessarily have to be included. But, it's overall, the intent's still the same. It's just they're adding some clarity, especially around the climate change, biodiversity, natural resource availability, ecosystem health, things of that nature. So, all right, yeah, environmental aspects. So this is, probably one of the bigger areas because this, an aspect is an activity, product, or service in which, the organization does that, interacts with the environment. And, of course, this includes upstream and downstream. Of course, the organization itself is, predominantly going to be focused on aspects that it can control, things that happen on site, the day-to-day activities, products they make, products they deal with, and then services. You get contractors that come on site. You can really, mostly control those, set up a visitor contractor agreement just to explain, the environmental program and review what kind of aspects they have and how that could impact the environment for the organization. Just like in the current version, of course, you have to use criteria to determine significance. None of that really changed. The life cycle perspective was there before, but, the emphasis is not necessarily controlling it, but influencing it more. Organization should look at cradle to grave type activities, but depending on the extent and the scope of the management system, it's more likely going to be something that you can influence versus control. For instance, requiring suppliers to be certified. If not, ask if they have an environmental management system. And there's also sources you can review to see, if they've had any environmental incidents that or statements about how they treat their product from a life cycle perspective as well. So, and along with the aspects, you have to look at abnormal and emergency situations. A normal situation would be a startup of a machine. An abnormal situation would be a startup of a machine that releases excessive pollution. That's normally not the situation. So you have to look at what is a normal situation and an abnormal, and what's a potential emergency. Could be a release of a gas to the environment. So when you're reviewing your aspects, you got to look at not just what is a normal situation, but abnormal. And that was the case with the existing standard. It's just that, those are the ones that have a greater potential to impact the environment than the normal situations. Planning a change, as Jim alluded to, the high-level structure is incorporating this in. It's in the other standards out there. If you compare it to like an ISO 9001, you want to do change in a planned environment. You don't want to be reactive. Unfortunately, sometimes there are reactive situations, but the idea is to come up with a structured approach to plan out a change. Like you're going to install a new piece of equipment. You want to look at, okay, what are these changes going to bring about? Are they going to introduce new aspects, new regulatory requirements? Is it going to require a change in processes, procedures, work instructions, additional training requirements? Not that it's a requirement of ISO 14001, but a similar standard, ISO 45001, has a management of change process, which could be a tool to utilize, managing change. So you look at the aspects, you look at compliance obligations, you look at current operational controls, you look at waste stream generation, just to make sure you do it in a structured approach, and the ultimate goal of course, preventing pollution to the environment, but then, also, just like I said, make it a controlled plan change. Unfortunately, with the reactive ones, like on a quality side, people would do like a quality alert. I guess you could do an environmental alert to say, hey, this is changing, this is the temporary change, and then we're working to make a permanent change.
One of the things that we see is not just from an environmental perspective, but from quality system perspective, is ineffective change control. People make changes and it causes a problem downstream. And the whole idea of planning for changes is to try to anticipate and be proactive and minimize downside risks as you make changes, and be more proactive in planning, in being more successful in the implementation. And that's part of the reason for this change.
Internal audit program, it's always been an inherited program in a management system. Regardless of certification, I've been asked the question, why do we have to do internal audits? Because I thought that's why you're here. No, certification is not a requirement to implement a management system, but to have a management system that's conformant, you have to do internal audits. Everything is basically the same. The biggest thing to add was objective. You have to define the objective of the audit. And it could be as simple as just determining conformity of the environmental management system. Unlike the criteria, which is basically, okay, what are we going to audit against, like the ISO 14001 standard. And the scope would be, okay, what's the breadth of the audit? Is it a full management system audit, or is it just a process? But the objective is, okay, what's the overall goal of conducting an internal audit? Impartiality is still there, reporting the results to top management is still there. So, the biggest thing was just adding the objective. And most organizations already kind of define the objective, but it's a key one just to make sure that you include, hey, what's the objective? Or, say the audit objective, scope, and criteria are, contained within this document to kind of explain the overall process.
I would challenge you to look at your existing internal audit reports to see if there's key phrases or sections that already address compliance to audit objectives being defined already. As Jared talked about, audit of the full EMS system, or it's a partial audit of these sections of the EMS, or compliance to legal and other requirements. Take a look at what you have already to see whether or not you already have it defined. And then if not, then it may be a matter of shoring that up to make that your audit records a little bit more robust, to clearly identify the audit objectives, the scope, what you're trying to audit and cover, the criteria that you're trying to establish with the audit.
A manager review, as Jim alluded to earlier in the presentation, instead of having one clause, which was 9.3, they've broken it up into subclauses, 9.3.1 being general, 9.3.2 being inputs, and 9.3 being outputs. So it basically took what was already there and just broke it up. The one thing they did use in the current standard is use the word consider these topics. They eliminated the word consider, so basically you're going to go through all those topics. Now keep in mind, if you get to a section, let's say you do it monthly and there's nothing really to talk about, you're going to mention something there, you're just not going to skip it. Your agenda will include all these items, and then, of course, as you get to each section, if there are actions that you've taken, like, changes to significant environmental aspects, you will definitely document it that yeah, we had a change in our significant environmental aspects. If not, you would simply say no changes at this time. And it all depends on the frequency in which you hold manager reviews. Most organizations at a minimum hold it annually. Now, if you do it more frequently, there more times you'll say, yeah, we haven't made any changes to significant environmental aspects, or we have a plan to change one in the future. We'll talk about it at the next meeting. But yeah, essentially covering all the inputs and outputs. And then, of course, you're looking at overall system suitability, adequacy, effectiveness, and alignment with the strategic direction, which was, again, current in the ISO 14001 2015 standard.
So bottom line is, Jared, really, we're not really looking at any new major changes. We're looking at clarifications, alignment to the Annex SL. What's your take on the impact of these changes?
As we've been talking throughout, and how I mentioned in the previous slides, that there aren't a ton of changes. Of course, we didn't go through all the changes, all the elements of the standard, being it, we wanted to make it an executive overview, but point out the key changes. But in all honesty, the more I've read the new standard and the more I work with organizations, the changes aren't as substantial. Approximately 90-95% of the requirements are being met. It's just a matter of clarifying a few things here. Like I mentioned, adding objective to internal audit process, coming up with a planning of changes, which organizations may do. It's just a matter of now, hey, do we pull it into the environmental management system? So, like I said, you'll read some verbiage, as Jim alluded to the terminology up ahead, like fulfill, to meet, semantics. So, don't get caught up in the weeds when, there really aren't as significant changes as there were when they went from 2004 to 2015.
So what to do next? Hopefully we've given you some tips and ideas on understanding the transition and what you need to do next. We're going to talk about a little bit more detail about the next steps that need to occur as you work on transitioning and upgrading to the new standard. Certification bodies now that the standard is released have to train their auditors. They have to go through their accreditation to be able to issue certificates to the new standard. So that takes some time over the next 12 months. Some are going to be more proactive. Some have audits with their accreditation body coming up in a couple of months and are planning to be ready to issue certificates to the new standard sooner. So every CB is going to be different, but in the next 12 months, they'll be ready to issue certificates to the new standard. In the meantime, you're going to determine what impact it's going to have to your organization. Do you need to train your internal auditors? Do you need to have managers, process owners trained on the new requirements? And then you have to have an internal audit that's conducted to the new standard, evidence that you've audited the new requirements. And then you have to have a management review that shows that you've covered, have audited to the new requirements and that you're ready and complying with the new requirements before you get upgraded with your certification body. So then it's coordinating with your certification body on the right timing. What's the right cycle with your surveillances, with your recertification? When is that right timing that you're ready to make that jump and upgrade to the new standard with the deadline of April of 2029?
Also with that, you could do an internal gap analysis to kind of identify any gaps, with the training, with the system itself, just to help identify. And then, like I said, when you do your internal audit to the new requirements, that'll help, weed out any deficiencies, do appropriate level corrective actions, of course, talk about it in manager review. And even sometimes after the manager review is done, maybe you want to do an audit of that just to verify that it met the intent of the ISO 14001:2026 standard. And then, of course, work with your certification body, as Jim alluded to prepare for the audit. Would be a surveillance audit, a recert, whatever you feel comfortable. I mean, of course, that's why they usually give a 3-year transition, because, of course, certification bodies have to get up to speed. They get their auditors trained. And then, just to plan accordingly. So, and the more proactive you are, the better off. So even if you're not ready with the next year, maybe set a time frame for the next 2 years to become compliant, and as Jim alluded to, go through these steps to verify requirements are being met, and management review has been completed, and you should be good to go.
So Jared alluded to a gap assessment that you could perform. simpleQuE's prepared a gap checklist that is very nominal cost that you can purchase that focuses on what is actually changed clause by clause to help you identify where there's differences, and then also provide auditor tips so that they can be more effective in understanding the new requirements and auditing to ensure that there's evidence of compliance. And you're allowed to outsource your internal audits. If you need help doing your internal audits, please contact simpleQuE. We perform that for many companies and can help with any consulting, coaching needs that you might have in preparation for this upgrade. Bottom line, let us help you. Jared, thank you very much for your expertise and insights. We appreciate it. We appreciate you.
All right, you're very welcome, Jim.